Welcome, one and all. In my last video, I gave an introduction to my new video series based on my upcoming book titled Natural Law Essay and Critique of Stefan Molyneux, Jordan Peterson, and Ken Wilber. The goal of this project, consisting of a book and educational videos, is about exiting the intellectual cul-de-sacs of the Western mind to understand the timeless principles of natural law and their effects in reality, as to embody them and thus evolve. To simplify the concepts to be discussed, the underlying polarities between true philosophy and false ideology, between metaphysics and materialism, between natural law and relativism, and between spirituality and religion. What is required to understand true philosophy is holistic consciousness, the theme of this episode. Holistic intelligence is the consciousness required to perceive the 7 natural laws: mentalism, correspondence, vibration, polarity, gender, rhythm, and causality. Today we will be focusing on how correspondence and gender play a critical role in perceiving holistically. Holistic consciousness is the balance and integration of 2 particular polarities: a horizontal polarity of gender and vertical polarity of hierarchical correspondence. While masculine and feminine make the opposites of the horizontal pole, the lower and higher make the opposites of the vertical pole, which can be called eminent and transcendent, mind and manifestation. This polarity relates to the evolutionary planes of existence in the hierarchy of being, which extends much beyond this plane, related to the laws of vibration and rhythm as the ascension back to the infinite all. Gender is distinct from this vertical polarity since there are higher-lower expressions of gender and one gender is not higher than the other. Holistic consciousness is about and both, paradox, vertical hierarchy, and gender synthesis, while non-holistic or dualistic consciousness is about either or, contradiction, eminence versus transcendence, and masculine versus feminine, creating false dialectics. The main dialectic of our age is between science versus religion, and I add MGTOW versus feminism as culturally relevant. Authority can be considered the masculine, and belief in authority the feminine imbalance of man's enslaving systems. The vertical polarization is of transcendence and eminence, like the philosophical camps, idealism versus materialism, and rationalism versus empiricism. Now, a few clarifications need to be made. One regards the confusion that arises when gender and correspondence is perceived as a logical polarity. Logical polarities are mutually exclusive, in which either or is appropriate. While gender and correspondence are a particular polarity, there are many kinds, and in Hermeticism, polarity is considered a distinct principle from gender and correspondence. The misuse of polarity creates a false dialectic. Now, some may think that I'm producing a false dialectic between natural law and relativism, as well as metaphysics and materialism. But this is a real polarity between true philosophy and false ideology that we can access through their first principles. All false ideologies can be broken down into relativism and materialism. The two join together as pathological masculine and pathological feminine to create a poisoned worldview in the belief that our material conditions are all that is real and that there is no higher realms, no higher self, no higher principle, no higher law or absolute. What can make this confusing is that most religion and spirituality today, which claims to be about the higher, still comes from a relativistic materialist perspective. Mainstream religion believes in a material anthropomorphic God entity or a relative God for a chosen people and belief system. The New Age is fueled by materialistic pursuits and elevation of how one feels in the moment. And spiritual evolutionary theory is conditional to historical unfolding, failing to be open to the fact that evolution extends much beyond this particular plane of reality. The masculine archetype within the individual and society represents mind and principles, which when lost in relativism denies the existence of objective truth and morality, leading to the false political system of authority and the destruction of knowledge and freedom. The feminine archetype represents spirit and values, which lost in materialism serves money and narcissism, feeding financial enslavement and the bondage to the material plane through the destruction of real values such as love and goodness.
That is bullshit.
Another negative gender description perceived with holistic consciousness is how mind control operates through the human institutions of religion, education, media, and advertisement. The correct gender expression is knowledge, wisdom, and creative expression, which uplifts the planet towards more beauty, freedom, and goodness. What can be confusing, thus requiring clarification of context, is that in regards to consciousness, we can associate the lower with falsehood and the higher with truth, pertaining to the evolution of consciousness in the alchemical transformation from lower ego-embedded consciousness that is more prone to falsehoods to higher truth-oriented consciousness that is more prone to truth and the understanding of correct archetypes. Now, some have recognized that the lower manifest realm is illusory, while the higher realm is absolute reality. But this is a half-truth that requires the understanding of paradox, as we will get into, as the lower manifest realm is just as real as the higher realm as well. While both sides of a false dialectic have their partial truths, not all sides of false dialectics are equally false. For example, MGTOW is more true than feminism because it actually cares about truth and addresses some of the real social issues, such as the fact that men are more disadvantaged in our society than women, while feminism tends to believe in the modern-day myth of female oppression and patriarchy. However, these camps can be pitted against each other to create mental schism, as to elevate and victimize one gender over the other ontologically. Regarding gender and politics, to be discussed soon, capitalism is more true than socialism because it is based in the free market, although within the context of a controlled economy. Yet socialism is a purely controlled economy. With the vertical polarity, idealism is more true than materialism, and concurrently rationalism is more true than empiricism, because idealism and rationalism understand the existence of first principles, the law of mind, and the primacy of consciousness. Nonetheless, they can still be used to polarize the mind into imbalance, into the schisms of mind versus matter and reason versus sense perception. We are going to take a short break for some art. I find it's important to have art and philosophy together as its own gender polarity. Andy Gilmore is an artist who I feel depicts holistic consciousness in his style of geometric art. Enjoy. The horizontal polarity relates to the Hermetic law of gender, which states that gender is in everything. Everything has its masculine and feminine principles. Gender manifests in all planes. Holistic consciousness is the integration, balance, and synthesis of masculine and feminine modes of thinking with mental gender balance. The masculine mode of thinking is associated with the left brain hemisphere, and the feminine with the right brain hemisphere. The masculine is logic and analysis, the feminine patterns and big picture. The masculine is language and speech, the feminine nonverbal information. Masculine fact and memory, feminine emotion and dreams. Masculine reading and writing, feminine imagination and creativity. Masculine science and math, feminine art and music. Moving into more abstract distinctions relevant to philosophy, the masculine is differentiation, the feminine integration. The masculine linearity, the feminine non-linearity. Masculine deduction, feminine induction. Masculine particulars, feminine universals. Masculine concrete, feminine abstract. Masculine individual, feminine aggregate or collective. In the Natural Law Seminar is the portion about worldview schism. The war between masculine intellect and feminine intuition. Masculine imbalance leads to skepticism, scientism, atheism, solipsism, moral relativism, social Darwinism, eugenics, authoritarianism, while feminine imbalance leads to naivete, blind belief, religious extremism, solipsism, unworthiness, self-loathing, order following, and being a willing slave. Natural law is the healing of this worldview schism to understand the deterministic component of the cosmos as immutable principle and the free will of polarity. This is paradox, not contradiction. The biggest expression of worldview schism is with the political spectrum between the left versus right. The left mimics the feminine and mother archetype by seeking to provide welfare for all in the name of humanitarianism and universal care, while the right mimics the masculine father archetype by emphasizing personal responsibility and freedom to achieve and forge one's destiny. Yet the left seeks to provide through the immoral system of government, while the right seeks to achieve positions of corporate and political power in that immoral system, strongly supporting the military to wage imperialism. Both are corrupt expressions of gender, in which the left grows the state via taxation or theft, and the right grows the state through the pursuit of self-interest, domination, and power. Slavery is the system of mental gender imbalance, in which there are masters and slaves, dominator mentality of control, authority, and power, and submissive mentality of obedience, submission, and victimhood. It is important to understand the master-slave dialectic holistically, as the hierarchical structure of the control system is made of compartmentalized levels of simultaneous master and slave, in which one level is the master of the lower level and slave to the higher level. This is how evil works, as no one is ever truly a master to someone else without being enslaved by something else or someone else. One imbalance feeds into its opposite. Hegel spoke about the master-slave dialectic, but his notions tend to be overly abstract in his style of idealism. Nonetheless, he did talk about how one's self-consciousness is the product of its contrast to another consciousness, and how this dialectic of self and other produces conflict at the phenomenological, unconscious level, in which there is a war of competing consciousness that has to be reconciled with a synthesis to find an equilibrium of mutual expression and cooperation that is not about domination. Marx attempted to ground Hegel's abstraction in a very concrete way, to see the master-slave dialectic in terms of human systems, such as human labor and exploitation in capitalist society. The irony is that money is not a real object, nor is economics, but mental abstractions and abstract numbers that people merely believe in. So the higher economic classes are only that way through belief in false value. Regardless, Marx correctly saw the master-slave dialectic between the economic classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, yet he failed to see the real masters behind the scenes, which are much above the monetary system, the dark occult priest class. The real differential of power is not of money but knowledge, as they use spiritual knowledge against man by tricking man to abdicate responsibility and sovereignty to false authority. When you study conspiracy, you will find many different levels. The bankers, the Committee of 300, the 13 ruling bloodlines. Yet the dark occultists at the top play a higher level game from a lower vibration, ironically, as they attempt to use dark sorcery to rule over Earth in opposition to natural law. Now, some people may see dark sorcery as fantasy and fiction, but it's really just the ability to get people to believe in things that don't exist, like government, like money, like religion. But the truth is that the dark occultists are enslaved by their own ignorance and opposition to truth, as the prison they create the world in merely reflects the prison of their own consciousness. Thus, real slavery is not the product of money, that's just a symptom, but the product of slavery of the mind, and the false belief in authority all throughout the ages. In our exploration of the Western mind, we seek to deoccult the false ideologies that prevent man from true freedom. Because Marx did not have the right diagnosis, his solutions were flawed. Communism is merely the dialectical swing to the opposite side, to make the proletariat the new bourgeoisie, the new masters. This is no growth, which is why communism is the same as capitalist fascism. Revolutions will always occur in the rhythm of the dialectic, but evolution is an entirely different matter, which requires the alchemical transformation of consciousness to rise out of the egoic self-interest of power and the weakness of apathy and conformity into becoming more aligned to cosmic principles. Hegel and Marx represent the idealist versus materialist axis, which can be reconciled through the correspondent polarity of principle and manifestation. The correspondent polarity can also be related to cause and effect. The causal factors of reality exist in the invisible spiritual realm of consciousness in higher forms, while the effects are tangible and perceptible. In this sense, the idealist versus materialist and related rationalist versus empiricist debate is resolved by understanding invisible mental principles and archetypes as the realm of causes for the empirical results in reality. We do create reality within the context of natural law. The law of freedom states that the more moral an individual is, the more freedom, goodness, and love one will manifest in their life conditions. Through correspondence, this applies the same to the aggregate. Hegel tried to understand mental principles through the notion of the absolute mind, understanding that the universe is mental. He had a good glimpse into the gender dialectic with his notion of synthesis, yet he failed to take into account the polarity of good and evil that we should not synthesize. The polarity of good and evil manifest in relation to the gender dialectic through the perpetrator-victim cycle, in terms of being harm and creating harm. We should note that the feminine victim is not less accountable, as self-loathing is a type of self-harm that attracts harm. Pathological submissiveness, victim complex, and denouncing the self-defense principle are just as dark as their aggressive opposites. In the psychological shadow, the opposite gender pathology is merely being repressed. Harm is also living selfishly without concern for truth, freedom, and morality, in which we unconsciously make transgressions against natural law due to the behaviors of lower consciousness. This creates negative effects in concrete reality, the conditions of individual and collective slavery. Marx was aware of some of these negative enslaving effects, even though he fell into economic reductionism. So as a materialist, he would envision the ideal social system as the resolution, lacking understanding of the principles of consciousness and the causal factors for slavery. relativism, materialism, and our immoral belief systems and wrong actions. Both Hegel and Marx saw evolution as the progression of false dialectics. But this is not true evolution, merely controlled opposition. We do not find balance from going from one gender extreme to the other via revolution, but by integrating what is good and true of gender polarity through a rise in consciousness as to become more holistic. Nietzsche was critical of the slave side of the master-slave dialectic, criticizing weak morality and slave religion, as he was accurately criticizing feminine imbalance of obedience, self-loathing, unworthiness, and pacifism found in Christianity. However, his resolve was to become the master with his notion of the Superman, the Übermensch, and will to power, which is simply the exercise of the other extreme, pathological masculine of ruthless competition and conquest. Nietzsche considered morality to be restrictive dogma to the will, which leads to moral relativism. It is no surprise, then, that Nietzsche was the inspiration for the fascist leaders Hitler, Stalin, and Mussolini. True holistic consciousness understands the non-aggression principle and the self-defense principle. We should become the masters of ourselves through self-rulership and self-mastery, but without initiating violence towards others as to be in alignment with natural law. With the vertical schism of correspondence, we have the war between matter versus spirit. The empiricists deny the existence of pure reason and the primacy of consciousness, and the nominalists deny universals, and the Satanists and Luciferians deny spiritual absolutes, and generally, the materialists deny higher principles. Some people place Plato and Aristotle on this vertical polarity. Plato with transcendence, and Aristotle with eminence. And here we have the Neoplatonists and the Manichaeans who believe that spirit is goodness and matter is evil, like the Gnostic misteaching that matter is created by the archonic demiurge. On the other hand, the empiricists, positivists, and scientists say that matter is all there is, and the notion of spirit is speculative and meaningless. Now, at the highest level, matter and spirit are the same from the absolute perspective. And from the relative perspective, matter is a degree of spirit, so that the increasing degrees form the evolutionary levels and cycle back to the all, in which the higher has ontological priority over the lower. This is Gennis Carreras, who created philographics, which I think is a very neat idea. And using his conceptual art, we will look at the false dialectics of philosophy that are the result from a collapse of gender polarity and collapse of correspondence polarity, called mental reductionism. Here we have absolutism versus relativism, which relates to the eminence versus transcendence polarity that we have just discussed about matter versus spirit. To reconcile these opposites, it is important to understand the two-truth doctrine of the absolute and the relative and their relationship. In order for the relative to have any realness and fixed truth, there must necessarily exist an absolute realm that is not contingent or dependent to matter for matter to correspond to. In other words, every manifestation corresponds to the absolute to some relative degree. If there was no absolute that was completely pure in its absoluteness, then all would be relative in contradictory fashion, and reality would be purely contingent to the observer. Note that relativism and relative are two different things. Yes, things are relative, but the ideology of relativism is incorrect. While things are relative, there is still an objective ground to that relationship. A common philosophical error is to see the absolute and relative as contradictory instead of correspondent and paradoxical. Now we are going to discuss the false dialectics quadratically, using the principle of gender and correspondence. In this matrix, the masculine is the left, feminine is the right, eminent is the bottom, and transcendent is the top. Thus, we have 4 quadrants: eminent masculine, eminent feminine, transcendent masculine, and transcendent feminine. Now I am going to categorize some philosophical ideologies, but please note that we are using a general association method in which there are overlapping elements. This is not a strict left brain categorization like classification. It is merely a useful association to understand false dialectics. The eminent masculine associates with medieval nominalism of William Ockham, modern empiricism of Hume, Bacon, and Kant, postmodern, meaning after-modern, logical positivism with Russell and Wittgenstein. In this quadrant, I forgot to mention Democritus and Leucippus, the pre-Socratics who came up with atomism, later used in modern science. Here there is the flavor of the concrete individual over the abstract universal. In the eminent feminine quadrant, we have existentialism with Nietzsche and Heidegger, phenomenology with Husserl and Bergson, process theory with Whitehead, and postmodern metaphysics with Deleuze. In here I mean postmodern as the philosophical movement. As a side note, and in the future, I will be releasing some material on Gilles Deleuze, who attempted to bring back Aristotelian metaphysics postmodern style. His thinking is relevant today as the underpinning for complexity and chaos theories and some of the new sciences. Yet his models turn classification upside down for a metaphysics of eminence and pseudo-non-dualism. Also, Marxism could be placed in this eminent feminine quadrant, as well as the theories of economics. In the transcendent masculine, we have the Manichaeans and Neoplatonists, maybe even Platonists to a certain degree, who elevated spirit over matter, seeing spirit as good in the physical world of flesh as sin. Additionally, in this quadrant is modern rationalism with Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, idealism with Hegel, Fichte, and Schelling, and the postmodern intellectuals playing with abstract ideas for pretense. The transcendent feminine can be associated with medieval mysticism of Eckhart, but generally Western philosophy is not in this quadrant, but aspects of esoteric philosophy can be imbalanced here. Some examples are Theosophy with Madame Blavatsky and Alice Bailey, and the present-day New Age with Abraham Hicks and Marianne Williamson, also the divination arts. Here is another way to depict the quadrants of non-holistic consciousness in a general way. The eminent masculine is scientism. The eminent feminine is materialism and money. The transcendent masculine is man's law, politics. And the transcendent feminine is the New Age, solipsism, and collectivism. Another description is the eminent masculine as atomic reductionism, the eminent feminine as narcissism and selfishness, the transcendent masculine as meaningless abstraction, and the transcendent feminine as religion and blind belief. These worldviews ultimately represent the same thing, anti-truth and anti-philosophy, as the obfuscation of natural law. So they of course interrelate in ways in which a categorical matrix cannot elucidate. Suffice it to say that there are different types of poison. Now, just for fun, if we were to divide the 7 laws, I would put the law of polarity and causality, which includes logic and morality, into the eminent masculine, while I would put the law of vibration and rhythm into the eminent feminine, being more subtle of the laws. And then I would put law of mind as the transcendent masculine, and the law of one or infinite all as the transcendent feminine. And then of course the 2 other laws have created this matrix. And, just for more fun, this could be simplified as truth, goodness, freedom, and love.